AITA for telling my mom not to babysit anymore when my husband changed his mind. To start, my husband and I both have intense, high-demand careers. He is a lawyer, and I am an engineer, which means long hours, deadlines, and a lot of stress. We have been married for several years, and before we had children, we both agreed that our careers were incredibly important to us. I was always content with the idea of having one child. Our daughter was everything to me, and between work and parenting, I felt like my hands were full. But my husband really wanted another child. He kept pushing for it, saying that he didn't want our daughter to grow up alone and that having a sibling would be the best thing for her. I wasn't as convinced, but eventually, I agreed. Fast forward, and now we have two beautiful daughters, one who is 3 and the other who just turned 1. After my maternity leave with our second, I knew going back to work was going to be challenging. We needed childcare, and daycare options in our area were limited. I was incredibly fortunate that my mother, who had been a nurse for years, offered to step in and help us. She had been considering leaving her job anyway, and I told her that if she was going to take on full-time childcare for our kids, we were going to compensate her fairly. Now, let me be clear, my mom was not just watching our kids. She was doing everything. She was feeding them, changing them, teaching them, taking them outside, and sometimes even picking them up when our schedules were chaotic. She was also cooking for them and making sure our home functioned smoothly in ways that a daycare never could. I knew what the going rate for daycare was in our area, around $1,500 per child, meaning that the cost for 2 kids would be $3,000 per month. That's what I told my husband we would pay her. I didn't feel comfortable asking her to give up her job without fair compensation, and I knew she wouldn't have asked for a dime if I hadn't insisted. From the moment my husband realized how much we were paying my mom, he started complaining. He kept saying that it was too much, that she was our children's grandmother, and that watching them should be a privilege for her. I was stunned by his attitude. I kept explaining that if we weren't paying my mom, we would be paying a daycare at the same rate, except daycares wouldn't cook for them or be as flexible with pickups. But he kept acting like we were overpaying her and made his feelings known, even directly to my mom's face. She is not a confrontational person, but I could see how much it hurt her. She never said anything to him, but I could tell she was deeply uncomfortable with the way he was treating the situation. I fought with him about this for months. I told him that if he felt like we were overpaying her, he could find a cheaper option. I told him to research daycare costs, look into nannies, find something more affordable if he truly believed it existed. But he never did any of that. He just kept complaining. Eventually, I had enough. I told my mom that she should go back to work because I could tell she was feeling disrespected, and I refused to let my husband continue to make her feel like she was some sort of financial burden. So she did. She went back to nursing, and we found a daycare for our kids. But daycare was not $1,500 per child anymore, it was now $1,800 per child, totaling $3,600 a month. More than what we were paying my mom. And of course, daycare didn't include meals, didn't accommodate our schedules, and didn't pick up our kids when we were stuck in the office. And then reality hit. Daycare meant that our kids were constantly exposed to germs. The first winter after we switched, our entire household was sick 3 times within just a few months. When one of us got sick, we all got sick. I was traveling for work once when my husband was supposed to pick them up, but he was late, and daycare charged us a $75 late fee. The stress was piling up, and our lives felt so much harder than when my mom had been helping us. Now, after months of struggling, my husband has completely changed his tune. He is suddenly realizing just how much my mom was doing for us, and now he wants her to quit her job again and go back to watching our kids. But here's the thing, my mom is now making $4,300 a month working part-time as a nurse. That is significantly more than what we were paying her. And frankly, I don't think it is fair to ask her to give up her income again unless we pay her what she is making now. I told my husband that if he wants her to come back, we have to pay her at least what she is earning at her job. He refuses. He is furious with me and says that my mom is asking for too much money for what he calls a simple job. He insists that taking care of her grandchildren should not come with a price tag and that she should feel honored to do it. But the reality is, she has bills, she has retirement to think about, and most importantly, she has already been treated poorly by him once. I am not about to let that happen again. I told her not to quit, and I told my husband that this is his fault. He had no problem whining about how expensive it was when we were paying my mom, but he never once did the research to see what daycare would really cost or how difficult it would make our lives. And now that it has blown up in his face, he wants to go back to how things were, except on his terms. I refuse. I refuse to ask my mom to give up her job unless we pay her what she deserves. And honestly, I do not even know if she would say yes at this point, because I think she saw how unappreciative he was, and I would not blame her if she did not want to put herself in that position again. Now my husband is furious with me, claiming that I am making our lives harder just to prove a point. But I think the point has already been proven. I think he needs to accept that he made a mistake and that actions have consequences. So, am I the asshole here? Update 1. After weeks of constant fighting, my husband doubled down. He refused to admit he had made a mistake, refused to acknowledge that he had disrespected my mother, and most of all, refused to take responsibility for the fact that our current situation was a direct result of his own complaints. Instead, he shifted the blame onto me. He began to guilt me, saying that I was the one making things difficult for us, that I was holding a grudge instead of looking at what was best for our family. He even had the audacity to suggest that I was being vindictive, that I was dragging this out just to punish him, to teach him a lesson rather than genuinely wanting what was best for our daughters. I didn't budge. I told him bluntly that if he wanted my mother back, he had to pay her what she was making now. Otherwise, he needed to deal with the daycare situation without complaint. I refused to keep arguing about it because, to me, there was nothing left to argue. He had already seen what life was like without my mother's help. He had already experienced the inconvenience, the added costs, the sickness, the late fees. There was no logical reason for this to still be an ongoing debate. But he didn't see it that way. Frustrated, he did something I never thought he would do. He went behind my back and called my mom himself. He actually tried to convince her to come back on the original terms, as if she had just been sitting around, waiting for him to change his mind, as if she wasn't living her own life, working a real job, making real money. When I found out, I was beyond furious. It was bad enough that he refused to admit he was wrong, but the fact that he went behind my back, tried to negotiate with her as if I wasn't involved in this at all, made me see red. But what really surprised me was her response. My mother was always non-confrontational, always the type to avoid unnecessary conflict, but she must have had enough because she was completely firm with him. She told him that if he wanted her to quit her job, she had one condition: she wanted Sundays to be a full day off. No childcare, no calls, no last-minute emergencies. She was willing to come back, but she was going to carve out that one day for herself, no matter what. At first, I didn't think it was a big deal. Honestly, it seemed like a reasonable request. But then she dropped the bombshell: she was serious about dating again, and she didn't want to be tied down every single day. She had met someone. I was stunned, not because I thought she would never date again, but because I had never heard her talk about it before. She had been a single mom for so long that I had almost assumed she would always be focused on family and work, never really putting herself first. But now, for the first time, she was prioritizing her own happiness. And I was happy for her. She had spent years taking care of others, and if she had met someone she liked, someone who made her feel good, then she absolutely deserved to see where it would go. My husband, on the other hand, was furious. It was like he could not comprehend the idea that my mother had a life outside of being a grandmother. He grumbled that night, pacing in our kitchen like a man who had just been given the worst possible news. He kept muttering about how absurd it was, about how ridiculous it was that she would put dating over her own grandchildren, over our family. He kept repeating it, as if saying it enough times would make it make sense in his own head. What makes a guy more important than her grandchildren? I just stared at him. The hypocrisy was so blatant that I could hardly believe he was saying it with a straight face. He, the man who had spent the entire past year prioritizing his job over our children, the man who had fought tooth and nail to avoid paying my mom a fair wage, the man who had complained about expenses but never once offered to change his own schedule to accommodate the kids. I didn't yell. I didn't snap. I didn't need to. I just looked at him and said, "You mean your job was more important than your children when you refused to take a day off when they were sick?" After that, he fell silent. Update 2. I decided to have my own conversation with my mom, on my terms. I didn't want my husband meddling in this again, trying to manipulate her into something she didn't want to do. I wanted to be clear, direct, and completely fair. He had already gone behind my back once, and I wasn't about to let him twist things to his advantage again. My mom had spent enough time being treated like an afterthought, and if this was going to work, it had to be on conditions that made sense for her. When I sat down with her, I laid everything out. I told her that I would only consider her coming back as our full-time childcare provider under 2 conditions. First, we would pay her exactly what she was making now as a nurse, not a penny less. She had built a career, spent years working her way up, and had earned her salary through experience and skill. If we wanted her to walk away from that, she deserved full compensation for the financial security she was giving up. Second, we would absolutely respect her Sundays off, no calls, no unexpected emergencies, no excuses. She had already sacrificed so much of her time and personal life for us, and if she was going to make this sacrifice again, she deserved boundaries. She surprised me again. She didn't even hesitate before saying, "I'll do it, but only if he apologizes to me first." I actually laughed out loud because I knew how impossible that request was. My husband was stubborn to a fault. He was the type who would dig himself into a hole before admitting he was wrong, the type who would let himself suffer just to avoid saying the words, "I was wrong." He had spent months refusing to take accountability for the way he treated her, for the way he had dismissed her efforts, and now she was putting up the simplest, most reasonable condition, an apology. I knew immediately that this was going to be the one thing that would send him spiraling. I told her straight up, "You want him to apologize? You know that might never happen, right?" She just shrugged, completely unbothered, and said, "Then I guess I'll keep working." That was the moment I realized she had all the power here. For the first time since this whole mess started, she wasn't the one being asked to bend, to compromise, to give more than she was getting. She had finally drawn a line in the sand, and it was up to my husband to decide if his pride was more important than getting the help he so desperately wanted. I left that conversation feeling lighter than I had in months. She had taken back her power. She knew her worth, and she wasn't going to let my husband treat her like an employee he could underpay and complain about whenever it suited him. And the best part? The decision was now completely in his hands. He could either apologize and get exactly what he wanted, or he could continue suffering under the crushing weight of his own ego. When I told my husband, he looked like he had just swallowed a lemon. His face twisted, and I could see the immediate internal battle raging in his head. He scoffed, shook his head, and snapped, "Apologize? For what?" His voice was full of indignation, like he truly couldn't fathom what he had done wrong. Like the months of him treating my mother as disposable, devaluing her work, and dismissing her feelings had just evaporated from his memory. I reminded him of everything. I laid it all out, each moment where he belittled her, each complaint about paying her fairly, each time he made her uncomfortable in her own home. I reminded him that the only reason we were in this situation now was because he had driven her away, only to come crawling back when he realized that daycare wasn't the perfect, easy solution he thought it would be. I told him that if he truly wanted her back, if he wanted her to step in and make his life easier again, then the absolute bare minimum he could do was apologize. He refused. He crossed his arms, huffed, and grumbled that my mom was being dramatic. He said that family doesn't need apologies, that this was all unnecessary, that she was just holding a grudge to make things difficult. He acted like saying 2 simple words was some kind of Herculean task, like admitting fault would somehow erase his authority as a father, as a husband. He was still clinging to the idea that he had done nothing wrong, that this was all just some petty power move instead of a direct consequence of his own behavior. I didn't argue. I didn't try to force him to see reason. I just looked at him and said, "Then enjoy paying daycare, babe." And that was the end of that conversation. There was nothing more to say. He wanted to make this harder than it needed to be. Fine. Then he could live with the consequences. The standoff lasted another month. A long, grueling month where daycare continued to be an absolute nightmare. The dream scenario he had envisioned, where daycare would be the perfect, easy, low-cost alternative, had completely fallen apart, and yet he still refused to admit that this was his own doing. He continued to grumble every time a new problem cropped up, but instead of taking responsibility, he just got angrier, more frustrated, more resentful. Our youngest got hand, foot, and mouth disease, a brutal, highly contagious virus that ran through the house like wildfire. First, it was the baby, then our 3-year-old, then me. The daycare called in the middle of a workday, telling us we needed to pick up our child immediately because she had developed symptoms. I was in the middle of an important meeting and had to drop everything to rush out the door. The next 2 weeks were hell, sleepless nights, cranky, miserable kids, endless doctor visits. I had to cancel an important work trip at the last minute because there was no way I could leave while dealing with a sick, miserable toddler. My husband, of course, kept working like nothing had changed, refusing to rearrange his schedule, refusing to even acknowledge how much I had to pick up the slack. He would come home exhausted from work and complain about how loud the house was, how chaotic things had become, as if I wasn't drowning in it all day long. A few weeks later, he got stuck in traffic again, which led to another late daycare pickup. Another late fee. Another round of angry, frustrated pacing in the kitchen, another round of him muttering under his breath about how ridiculous the whole system was. He started to realize that no matter how much he complained, the daycare wasn't going to bend to his will. There were no exceptions, no flexibility, no one cutting him a break just because he was a father with a demanding job. He was just another parent paying for a service, and if he failed to follow their rules, he would be penalized for it. It was an incredibly slow process, but I could see it happening, piece by piece. The illusion of control was slipping through his fingers. He was realizing that he wasn't as powerful in this situation as he thought he was. He was realizing that the comforts and conveniences he had once taken for granted, the home-cooked meals, the flexible childcare, the ability to adjust schedules without penalty, had all been privileges he had failed to appreciate. He was realizing that my mother, the very person he had dismissed and undervalued, had been doing far more for us than he ever acknowledged. And most of all, he was realizing that the only thing standing between him and an easier life was his own refusal to swallow his pride. Slowly but surely, reality crushed his pride. Update 3. One evening, after yet another daycare disaster, this time, a last-minute closure due to staff shortages, I found my husband pacing the kitchen, rubbing his temples like the weight of the world was pressing down on him. He looked completely exhausted, more drained than I had ever seen him. His tie was loose, the top button of his shirt undone, his sleeves rolled up as if somehow making himself physically more comfortable would take the pressure off his mind. His hair was a mess from him running his hands through it repeatedly, and his jaw was clenched so tightly that I could practically hear his teeth grinding. His entire body radiated frustration and fatigue, a man drowning under the weight of his own choices. The chaos of the past few months was catching up to him in a way he couldn't ignore. The endless disruptions, the sick days that threw our work schedules into disarray, the late fees that stacked up every time he miscalculated his availability, the missed meetings that left him scrambling to make up for lost time. He had spent so long believing daycare would be an easy solution, that it would be structured and reliable and worth the cost, but the reality had been nothing short of a nightmare. The moments of panic when he got stuck in traffic and realized the minutes were ticking down to another penalty. The exhaustion of dealing with constant sickness, of watching our daughters suffer through ear infections, fevers, coughs that never seemed to end, only for another wave of illness to hit as soon as they recovered. The guilt that came with knowing we weren't able to give them the comfort they needed because work still demanded our attention. The frantic calls between us, trying to negotiate who would rearrange their day, who could afford to take the hit this time. This time, there was no blaming me, no blaming my mom, no pretending this was anything other than the direct consequence of his choices. There was no way to rationalize it, no way to twist the situation into something that absolved him of responsibility. He had spent so long resisting, so long convincing himself that he was right, that he hadn't realized how much harder he had made life for himself. His ego had built him a prison, and now he was pacing inside it, looking for a way out. I watched him, arms crossed, waiting. There was nothing left to say on my end. He had reached the breaking point, and all that was left was for him to admit it. Finally, he muttered, "Fine. I'll apologize." The words were so unexpected, so out of character, that for a second, I thought I had misheard him. He had been holding out for so long, refusing to budge no matter how bad things got. The idea that he was finally giving in, that he had finally reached the point where his pride wasn't worth it anymore, felt almost surreal. I blinked, trying to process what I had just heard, and asked him to repeat himself. He grumbled the same thing again, but his voice was laced with bitterness, like the words physically pained him to say. He would do it. He would apologize. I didn't ask him when or how. I didn't offer to be there when he did it. I just let him go, watching as he finally made the call he should have made months ago. He disappeared into the other room, phone in hand, and I let him have his moment. I didn't need to hover. I didn't need to witness it. I already knew what the conversation would sound like, his voice strained, his sentences clipped, his pride making every syllable feel like pulling teeth. I didn't expect him to grovel, but I knew my mother. She wouldn't have accepted a half-hearted apology. If she was going to come back, she would make sure he knew exactly why he had to ask for her in the first place. When I saw her name pop up on my phone later that evening, I already knew what the call was about. She didn't waste time. She told me she would do it. She would come back. But then she hit me with one more condition. If she was going to do this long term, if she was going to walk away from her career again and take on the full-time role of caring for our kids, she wanted a raise. Not right away, but in 6 months. A $500 increase, no debate, no negotiation. If we wanted to keep her, we had to show her that we valued her the way we should have from the beginning. I laughed so hard I cried. My mom had played the long game and won. She had watched my husband spiral, watched him struggle, and had remained completely unshaken. She hadn't rushed to save him, hadn't let him off the hook when he first realized his mistake. She had waited, held firm, and let him learn the lesson for himself. She had held her ground, letting him flail until he had no choice but to acknowledge just how badly he had underestimated her worth. And now, at the very moment he had finally come crawling back, she secured exactly what she deserved. And just like that, she was back. This time, though, everything was on her terms. Sundays were hers, untouchable, non-negotiable. No more desperate phone calls, no more panicked last-minute changes to her schedule. If we wanted her, we had to respect her boundaries. There was no expectation that she would be available whenever it was convenient for us. If she wanted to sleep in, take a day trip, spend time with friends, or go on a date, it was entirely her choice. For the first time, my mother wasn't just a caregiver or a support system, she was a person, with her own life, her own plans, her own priorities. We paid her exactly what she made at her nursing job, down to the cent, and in 6 months, we would give her the raise she had rightfully asked for. There was no haggling, no bargaining, no trying to shave off a little here and there. She set the terms, and we accepted them. It wasn't a favor. It wasn't a family obligation. It was a job she was damn good at, and she was going to be compensated accordingly. The transition back was seamless. It was like breathing again after months of suffocation. No more scrambling, no more late fees, no more endless daycare sickness cycles. The stress that had been a constant weight pressing down on me lifted almost overnight. The kids were happy, well-fed, and cared for in ways daycare never could provide. There was no more worrying about what they were eating, no more concerns about the rigid structure that didn't allow for flexibility when they weren't feeling well. My mom cooked for them, made sure their routines were consistent, picked them up when our schedules got hectic. The warmth of home returned, the sense of stability that had been missing for months finally restored. My husband, the same man who had once whined about every dollar spent, never dared to complain again. He knew better now. He had seen what life was like without her help, had lived through the consequences of his stubbornness. He had learned, through cold, hard reality, just how much my mom had been doing for us. And now that she was back, he wasn't about to do anything to risk losing her again.